Random thoughts. In this video, I'll discuss the proposal to merge Kenya and Uganda and then exclude the land occupied by the Somali people. That is a proposal that is discussed by Sir Charles Eliot in his book, The East Africa Protectorate. Now, Sir Charles Eliot was what was known as the Commissioner of British East Africa. This was like the highest ranking British official in the land that was known as the East Africa Protectorate. And this is the land that later on became the Kenyan colony and later on became the Republic of Kenya. Now, Sir Charles Eliot served in that office from 1902 to 1904. He resigned and then he publishes this book in 1905. And this is a very detailed, comprehensive book that discusses the different aspects of the protectorate, from the geography, the history, the people, the potential for agriculture and business, and the settlement of the Europeans, and really everything. Now, in this book, he discusses, of course, the political organization of the protectorate. And in another video, I have talked about the frustration that existed in the European settlers about the government of Britain, or the British government, taking so long to make the East Africa Protectorate a colony, because by making the East Africa Protectorate a colony, that was going to make it easier for the Europeans to get land and to start business, and also it was going to be easier for the government, of course, to fund infrastructure projects, which was not happening, at least not at the speed that the Europeans wanted. Now, at some point, there was a consideration to merge Uganda and Kenya. Of course, the Ugandan side was called the Uganda Protectorate, and the Kenyan side was called the East Africa Protectorate. And the Uganda side, of course, included, at some point, actually, the Ugandan side included the land from the current border between Uganda and Kenya up to Naivasha. But very early on, maybe 1900, that part was also included to be part of the East Africa Protectorate. And Sir Charles Eliot does discuss that change in this book. Now, after the change of that border, there was still consideration, or there was still discussions on how to, of course, to administer the two protectorate. And then at some point, it seems like there was a discussion or a proposal to have the two protectorate merged to become one protectorate. And maybe if that had happened, today Kenya and Uganda will be one country. But it did not happen for some reason. Now, this proposal also includes a very interesting component to it. And this is the component that the land that is occupied by the Somali people is not going to be part of the new unit for some reason. But it does give us the reason as to why. He says that that's because the Somali are completely different people. So he thought, or the people who were proposing this merger thought it was not good to have the Somali people become part of the new unit that, of course, was Uganda and the East Africa Protectorate. I'm going to read that part of the book where Sir Charles Eliot discusses that proposal. He says, "It is, however, generally agreed that it will be advisable to amalgamate the two protectorates, and if this is to be done, it is certainly ought to be done soon, for the longer they remain apart, the more they tend to become different in their administrative system and regulations, which is what should be avoided. There is no great diversity of interest between the two territories. If it were possible to detach the districts inhabited by Somalis, it would be an excellent thing to form them into a separate government, as they are different in population, economic, and physical conditions from other provinces. But unfortunately, they are too small to form a separate administration, and the adjoining Somali territories are not British." So he says that if it was going to be better if Uganda and the East Africa Protectorate are merged to become one, because then it would be easier to do things. But he also says it needed to be done as soon as possible, because the more they remained to be separate protectorate, the more difficult it was going to merge them later. And in fact, I think that's what happened. But then, of course, he makes a very interesting point that when that merger happens, it was necessary somehow to remove the Somalis from that merger. And his reasons are that these people are different in population, economic, and physical conditions. I don't know what he actually meant in that, because what does it mean that they are different in population? What does it mean that they are different in economic? What does it mean that they are different in physical conditions from the other provinces? I don't know what he actually meant. Of course, we can speculate what he meant, but it's very difficult to say what he actually meant. But now, for that to happen, to detach them from the rest of the East Africa Protectorate, there was another problem. And the problem was the area of the British Somali, that part of Kenya, of course, I'm not speaking about the British Somali, the other side, there is another British Somali. I'm speaking of the land occupied by the Somalis in what later on became the Republic of Kenya. He thought that it was too small to be formed into its own, we can say maybe protectorate or colony. It was too small for that to happen. And of course, the issue being that the other Somalis were not under the British. So the British had very little say in what happened to the other Somaliland. So they were only, what they could do was with what they had, which was, of course, what we know today as the northern part of Kenya. And maybe to some extent, maybe into Somalia today, maybe a little bit. And then, of course, they had a say in the other Somaliland, which was British colonized. But now they had the issue of, yes, they could remove the Somali from the rest of the so-called East Africa Protectorate. But then what do they do with them? Do they give them, or do they form them into a new protectorate, a separate one? That was not going to be viable, because that was going to be a very small protectorate, unless they were going to be combined with other Somalis. But these others were under of course, the Italians and, of course, the French. So that was not going to be possible. But anyways, at the end of it, the merger between Kenya and Uganda did not happen. Maybe they dragged on, and then at some point it was so difficult, they were so different to merge them into one protectorate. So it did not happen. But come to think of it, it is a good question as to why really didn't the British merge Kenya and Uganda? Why didn't it happen? Because these were two countries that were just next to each other. They were both protectorates of the British, and they were later on both, of course, colonized by the British. What made it so difficult to merge them? I think I can speculate. And I think Sir Charles Eliot kind of like give us some of that in this book when you read it. It has to do with how conducive both sides were to the settlement of the British. While the British saw Uganda as just a country that will become just another colony, they saw Kenya as land that was going to be actually a white man's land. And he says that, he does say that in the book, that Uganda was just going to be good maybe to collect taxes and maybe to do some things there, but the British were not going to settle there. And in fact, he gives, when you read further in this part of the book, he says that what was going to be good about merging the two, it was going to be easy, like the British officers who will serve in Uganda, and then at some point it was easy to move them to Kenya, where it was a little bit conducive for them, such that they can have a change of the weather and the places where they work, the workstations. It does discuss something of sorts. So I think the reason why in the end the two were not merged is because the British saw the two very differently. While they saw Uganda as just another colony, they saw Kenya as a country, or the East Africa Protectorate, as the land that really was going to be theirs and was very conducive for their settlement. I think that's why. Those are my random thoughts.